You've walked through Dunedin. Maybe you studied there. Maybe you visited. Maybe you just drove through on your way south. And at some point, you looked around at those enormous Victorian buildings, the grand stone facades, the wide streets lined with architecture that looks like it belongs in Edinburgh, not in a city of 130,000 people at the bottom of the South Island. And something felt off. The buildings are too big. The streets are too wide. The whole place looks like it was built for a city 3 or 4 times its size. And you probably thought what most people think, that Dunedin is a nice wee city that's seen better days, that it's charming in a faded kind of way, that it peaked sometime in the past and quietly shrank. But here's the thing nobody ever tells you. Dunedin didn't just see better days. Dunedin was the biggest, richest, most powerful city in all of New Zealand. Not Wellington, not Auckland, Dunedin. There was a time when more money flowed through Dunedin than anywhere else in the country, when the banks were headquartered there, when the first university was built there, when the population was exploding so fast they couldn't build houses quickly enough. And almost no Kiwi can explain what happened, why it got so big, why it stopped, and where all that money actually went. That's not your fault. This story gets taught as a history lesson when it should be taught as an economics lesson. Because what happened in Otago 160 years ago didn't just shape Dunedin. It shaped the entire economy you live in today. The banks you use, the infrastructure you drive on. The reason Auckland is Auckland and Dunedin is Dunedin. By the end of this video, you'll understand the Otago gold rush the way it actually works. Not as a chapter in a textbook, as the single event that turned New Zealand from an isolated collection of struggling settlements into a functioning modern economy. And you'll see why the pattern it created is still repeating itself right now in ways most Kiwis never notice. Everything about the Otago gold rush comes from 2 questions. The first is this. What happens to a tiny settlement at the bottom of the world when money floods in faster than anyone can count it? The second is this. Why did New Zealand's richest city end up as one of its smallest? Those 2 questions sound like they're about the past. They're not. The first one is about booms. The second is about what booms leave behind. And the answers explain not just Dunedin, not just Otago, but the economic shape of the entire country you live in. We're going to start with what Otago looked like before anyone found gold, because you can't understand the explosion unless you see how small the fuse was. Go back to 1860. Otago is a Scottish settlement. Dunedin, named after the Gaelic name for Edinburgh, is a small, serious Presbyterian community of about 12,000 people. The whole province has fewer people than a single Auckland suburb today. There's almost no capital. The roads are rough. The harbour is the lifeline. Everything the settlement needs comes by ship, and everything it produces leaves the same way. Wool, mostly. Some timber. Nothing that's going to make anyone rich. The rest of New Zealand isn't much better. Auckland is the capital, but it's tiny. Wellington is barely a town. Canterbury is farming country. The whole colony is remote, underfunded, and struggling to attract settlers. Britain has plenty of colonies, and New Zealand is one of the least glamorous. It's far. It's cold in the south, and there's no obvious reason to pour money into it. This matters because when you understand how small and fragile Otago was in 1860, you understand why what happened next was so explosive. This wasn't gold being discovered in a wealthy, established economy. This was gold being discovered in a place that had almost nothing. No banks, no rail, no university, no significant infrastructure. Otago before the gold was like a bach in the middle of nowhere. Roof, walls, but no one living there, and no road to get in. The gold didn't just bring wealth. It brought everything. Before you can understand either the boom or the legacy, you need to understand the idea that makes both of them make sense. And that idea is called boom-bust economics. Here's what it means in plain language. When a valuable resource is discovered in a place, money rushes in. People rush in. Businesses spring up to service those people. Infrastructure gets built to move the resource out. Banks open to hold the money. Towns appear almost overnight. Everything grows at a speed that feels like magic. That's the boom. But here's the part that most people miss. The resource runs out. It always does. Gold gets mined. Oil gets pumped. Forests get felled. And when the resource thins, the money slows. The people leave. The businesses close. The towns shrink. That's the bust. Now here's why this matters more than it sounds. The boom and the bust aren't two separate events. They're two phases of the same event. And what determines whether a place thrives or collapses after the bust isn't how much gold it found. It's what it built while the gold was flowing. Think of it like a river after heavy rain. The water comes down fast, floods the valley, covers everything. And when the water drops, what matters isn't how high it got. What matters is what's still standing. The buildings that survived, the bridges that held, the channels that were carved. Everything the flood left behind becomes the permanent landscape. That's boom-bust economics. And it's the single idea that explains everything about the Otago gold rush, everything about Dunedin's rise and relative decline, and everything about why the economic geography of New Zealand looks the way it does right now. The reason it matters to you today is that New Zealand is still a boom-bust economy. Dairy boom, housing boom, tourism boom. The resource changes. The pattern doesn't. And once you see the pattern in 1861, you'll recognize it everywhere. Now that you have the foundation, the two tools are straightforward. Let's start with the boom itself. In May 1861, a prospector named Gabriel Red found gold at a place called Gabriel's Gully, near what's now the town of Lawrence in central Otago. He wrote to the Otago Provincial Council and described his find. Within weeks, the news had spread. Within months, Otago was unrecognizable. Here's what the boom actually looked like. People came, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Otago's population went from roughly 12,000 to over 60,000 in less than 2 years. Ships arrived in Dunedin packed with miners from Australia, from California, from Britain, from Europe. Many of them had already chased gold rushes elsewhere. They knew what they were doing, and they brought money, tools, ambition, and demand. This matters because demand is the engine of an economic boom. 60,000 people need food, they need shelter, they need clothing, tools, transport, entertainment, banking, medical care. Every miner who arrived didn't just dig for gold, they spent money, and that spending created businesses, which hired people, which created more spending. Economists call this a multiplier effect. The gold itself was valuable, but the economic activity the gold created was worth even more than the gold. Dunedin became the hub. It had the harbour, it had the supply lines, and very quickly, it had the money. The Bank of New Zealand was founded in Dunedin in 1861. Not Auckland, not Wellington, Dunedin. Because that's where the capital was. That's where the deposits were flowing in. That's where businesses needed credit. Dunedin became the financial capital of the entire colony. And it wasn't just banking. The first university in New Zealand, the University of Otago, was established in 1869, funded in large part by the wealth the gold rush had generated. Railways were built to move ore and people. Hospitals were built. Grand buildings went up. Dunedin got gas street lighting before any other city in the country. For a time, it was the most modern, most cosmopolitan, most connected place in all of New Zealand. Then came the Chinese miners. From the mid-1860s, thousands of Chinese men, mostly from Guangdong province, arrived in Otago to work the goldfields. Many of them reworked claims that European miners had already abandoned, extracting gold that others had missed. They were extraordinarily efficient. They built communities. They contributed enormously to the economy of central Otago, and they did it in the face of significant discrimination, including a poll tax specifically designed to discourage Chinese immigration. Their story is part of the economic history of the gold rush, and it's part of the multicultural fabric of New Zealand. You can still see the remnants of Chinese settlements in places like Arrowtown today. The key point about the boom is this. The gold rush didn't just bring gold to Otago. It brought capital, people, institutions, infrastructure, and connections to the outside world. It compressed 50 years of economic development into 5. Otago went from a quiet farming settlement to the economic engine of New Zealand in less time than it takes to pay off a car loan. That's what a resource boom does. It doesn't add to an economy, it transforms it. But here's the question that the boom alone can't answer. If Otago had all of that, all the money, all the institutions, all the people, then why isn't Dunedin still the biggest city in New Zealand? That's where the second tool comes in, the legacy. The gold peaked in the mid-1860s. By the 1870s, the easy gold was gone. The alluvial deposits, the stuff you could pull from rivers and gullies with a pan and a sluice box, had been largely worked through. Industrial mining continued. Dredging operations carried on for decades, but the rush was over. The flood of people slowed, then reversed. Miners left for the next rush, the next opportunity. Some went to the west coast, where gold had been found at Hokitika. Some went back to Australia. Some went north to Auckland, where the economy was starting to grow on the back of timber, trade, and a more central location. And here's where most people get the story wrong. They look at Dunedin today, compare it to Auckland, and assume that Dunedin failed, that something went wrong, that the city made bad decisions or missed opportunities. But that's not what happened. What happened is exactly what boom-bust economics predicts. The resource thinned, the population redistributed, and the center of gravity shifted. But the institutions didn't disappear. They moved. The Bank of New Zealand, founded in Dunedin, eventually moved its headquarters north. The financial infrastructure that was built with Otago gold became the financial infrastructure of the entire country. The railways that were built to move ore became the railways that moved everything else. The University of Otago kept producing graduates who went on to work in Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch. Dunedin kept giving long after the gold stopped. This is the part that changes how you see the whole story. The wealth from the Otago gold rush didn't vanish. It migrated. It moved north. It moved into institutions. It moved into infrastructure. It moved into patterns of settlement and economic activity that still define New Zealand today. Auckland's dominance didn't come from nowhere. It came, in part, from being the place where Otago's wealth eventually landed. The banks that were built with gold money became the banks that financed Auckland's growth. The capital that was accumulated in Dunedin was redeployed across the country over decades. The financial system you interact with today, when you check your mortgage rate, when you log into your banking app, when you look at your KiwiSaver balance, that system has its roots in the goldfields of central Otago. And the University of Otago, still going, still one of the best in the country, still training doctors and lawyers and scientists, exists because miners pulled rock out of the ground in 1862, and the province was wealthy enough to build something that would last. That's what a boom leaves behind when the infrastructure is good. Not ruins, foundations. Here's the part most people never see. The boom and the legacy feel like two different stories. One is exciting, explosive, full of gold and growth. The other is quiet, gradual, a slow redistribution of wealth and people. But they're not two stories. They're the same story, the same money, the same institutions, the same energy, just in two different locations, separated by 160 years. Dunedin didn't fail, and Auckland didn't win. What happened is that Otago generated an enormous amount of economic energy in a very short time. And that energy built things, real things, banks, universities, railways, ports, legal systems, financial infrastructure, and then that infrastructure served as the scaffold for the rest of the country's growth. The wealth didn't stay in one place, because wealth never does. It flows to wherever the next opportunity is. And as New Zealand grew, the opportunities moved north. Think of Dunedin as the first stage of a rocket. It burned hot, it burned fast, it generated all the thrust, and then it separated. The payload, the modern New Zealand economy, kept going. The rocket didn't fail. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Every time you hear about a dairy boom in the Waikato, or a housing boom in Auckland, or a tourism boom in Queenstown, you're watching the same pattern. Resource creates wealth. Wealth builds infrastructure. Resource slows. Wealth redistributes. What survives is what was built to last. The Otago Gold Rush isn't history. It's the template. Here's where most people get it wrong. And these mistakes matter because they shape how Kiwis think about their own economy. The first mistake is treating the gold rush as ancient history, with no modern relevance. It's easy to think of miners with pans and sluice boxes as something from another era. But the economic pattern they created, boom, build, bust, redistribute, is exactly what New Zealand still runs on. Dairy is New Zealand's gold right now. Fonterra exports are the modern equivalent of gold shipments leaving Port Chalmers. And the question is the same as it was in 1865. What are we building with this wealth that will still be standing when the resource changes? The second mistake is thinking Dunedin declined because it did something wrong. Dunedin didn't mismanage its economy. It experienced the natural, predictable, well-documented pattern of every resource-driven boom in history. The gold thinned, people moved, capital followed. That's not failure. That's physics. And understanding this changes how you think about regional economic development across New Zealand today, from the West Coast to Taranaki to Northland. The third mistake is ignoring the contribution of the Chinese miners. The gold rush is often told as a European story. It wasn't. Chinese miners were a significant part of the Otago economy. They paid taxes, they spent money in local businesses, they built communities, and they did it all while facing legal discrimination. Their economic contribution was real and substantial, and leaving them out of the story means getting the economics wrong, not just the history. Let me show you exactly how this knowledge is useful right now. When you hear that Auckland keeps growing while smaller cities struggle to keep young people, you're watching the same pattern the gold rush set in motion. Economic gravity pulls population and capital toward the biggest centre. It happened when Dunedin's wealth moved north. It happens today when graduates leave Dunedin, or Invercargill, or Palmerston North, and head to Auckland for higher salaries. When you look at New Zealand's dependence on dairy exports, you can ask the gold rush question, what infrastructure are we building with this wealth that will outlast the boom? Because if global dairy demand shifts, or if environmental regulation changes the economics of farming, the same pattern applies. The resource changes. What you built with it is what remains. When you think about regional development, about why the government invests in infrastructure in smaller towns, the gold rush gives you the framework. Towns that build lasting things during good times, hospitals, universities, transport links, are the ones that survive when the cycle turns. Towns that only extract and spend are the ones that become ghost towns. Central Otago has ghost towns. It also has Dunedin. The difference is what was built. And when you look at your own finances, the same principle holds. Income is a resource. It flows in, sometimes more, sometimes less. What matters isn't the peak. It's what you build while it's flowing. KiwiSaver, skills, education, a home. The things that are still there when the income changes. Here's what you now know. The Otago Gold Rush turned New Zealand from an isolated, underfunded collection of settlements into a functioning economy in less than a decade. It created the banks, the university, the railways, and the financial infrastructure that the country still uses today. Every resource-driven economy follows the same pattern: boom, build, bust, redistribute. And New Zealand is still a resource economy. Dairy, tourism, housing. The resource changes. The pattern doesn't. Understanding the pattern means you can see it coming, whether it's in the national economy or in your own life. And the wealth of Otago didn't disappear. It migrated. Dunedin built the financial foundations of modern New Zealand and then watched its creation move to Auckland. The boom and the legacy aren't two chapters. They're the same money, in two different addresses. And the next time you walk through Dunedin and look up at those grand stone buildings that seem too big for the city they're in, you'll know the truth. They're not too big. The city was once that big. And what left Dunedin built everything else. This is general education, not personalized financial advice. If you need advice for your situation, talk to a licensed financial advisor.